Greetings and welcome back. This week's video is actually something that got done a couple weeks ago. We got it finished right before we left for DragonCon. And when I say right before we left for DragonCon, I mean right before we left for DragonCon. I was working on costumes the morning that we were packing up to head to Atlanta. So I've mentioned the fact that my son lives an hour away in previous videos when I was working on his aluminum Mandalorian armor. I managed to get him over at the house for a few hours one morning about a week before we left for DragonCon. I was able to do a final fitting on the chest plates and pieces that I needed, and I actually got him to stick around for a little bit to help create some of his armor. We were able to finalize the fitting and get things where I was relatively confident that they would be approvable based on size and spacing. Once we had that accomplished, it was actually fairly easy for me to progress the armor the rest of the way and get them finished up. So the first thing we needed to do was get the chest pieces cut to size. So they were too wide on the outsides, and so I basically marked them out and cut them out with a bandsaw, then rolled the edges back over. With all of the plates sized and fitted and set up ready to go, it was onto the codpiece. I used the same templates that I used for the rest of the armor. Codpiece has a piece of industrial sticky back Velcro across the top that corresponds with a matching strip on his girth belt to keep everything in line. And then it buckles to the vest with a couple of Kydex buckles that are sewn onto the vest in a couple of places, so the codpiece comes off fairly easily, and the buckles are adjustable so that you can tighten it or loosen it depending on what you need to do. And then, of course, it has the standard Mandalorian G-string that runs around in the back and attaches to the back of the vest. That way, you can undo it if you need to go to the bathroom or something. I ended up using the template for multiple things, so once I had it traced onto the aluminum, I made a couple of reference lines to line everything up and start getting the pieces that I need to get cut out. I really need to remember to sharpen these things. So I had it cut out to the shrinking stump to give it a little bit more of a dished profile. I had the base piece cut out. I modified the stencil a little bit, folded it in half, and let my son cut out his own codpiece. He cuts really slow, but he did a much better job of cutting in the lines than I do. Unfolded the stencil, traced it out onto another piece of 14 gauge aluminum. Slowly. And then we cut that one out. So with the two major pieces of the codpiece cut out, I used some kitty food container cardboard for templating the top piece. Started at the front, traced the curve, and used a couple pieces of painter's tape to stick it in place so that I could flip it over and trace what it was going to look like on the bottom piece. With everything held in place in painter's tape, I turned it upside down and traced what the bottom side was going to look like, and then cut the cardboard out. And then used a couple of scrap pieces of cardboard to make the side plates. No, I'm not trying to cut with the wrong side of the knife. I was creasing the cardboard. Traced the side plates out onto another piece of cardboard so that I had a cleaner stencil, added a couple of tabs to help make welding a little easier, and then cut those pieces all out. Transferred that to a piece of 14 gauge aluminum, cut those out, and started welding it all together. Took a little bit of time. Nice thing about aluminum is it gets hot, it's easier to work. So I do a small section, hammer it in place, and then flip it over, do the bottom section, and rinse and repeat until I had the whole thing welded up, if you want to call what I did welding.
In the end, it turned out pretty good. I'm a horrible welder, but I'm a really good grinder. For the shoulder bells, I just used the basic templated shoulder bells. My son's a little taller and a little wider at the shoulders, so I used the slightly larger size. Just transferred a line between the corners and then stuck them in the 3-in-1 tool to give them a slight bend. I did the first set while he was watching, and then my son did the second set. I showed him how to compare the pieces to make sure that the bends were even on each side. A few minor adjustments later, and we had two mostly matching pieces. Scribed around a line around the entire outside of each shoulder bell to use as a guide for when I was going to roll the edges over. And a piece of thick metal that I used for setting rivets and pouches and stuff like that. Stuck it in the vise and used it as a edge, a dolly, to roll the edges. What the proper technique for doing this is, but I tend to roll the straight long edges first and then go back and do all of the corners using a shorter piece of metal. Once I've got everything mostly rolled over, I'll go back and beat on the corners for a couple minutes and then go through and smooth up the lines as best I can. Flat surface and the square-headed body hammer, and then I can go through and do a little bit of cleanup work on each one of the edges. My trusty respirator, my palm sander, and some 80 grit sandpaper, and it's time to clean up these plates. I just pick a spot on the plate, sand the bottoms to make sure that there's no sharp edges, and then the tops to make sure that there's no residue and paint, and clean around the edges. Here you can see some of the little dimples from where I did the forming. I didn't quite get them all sanded out. I tend to leave those, and I intentionally weather them when I can, so they look a little bit battle rough.
The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the fasteners that I'm going to use to fasten the plates to the vest. If you watched the theory crafting video, then you will see that I used grommets and Chicago screws, or screw posts, to do mine and my wife's. This time I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to use pinbacks and locking pinback backs. Locking pinback backs. I don't know, that's a lot of backs. Anyways, I'm going to try something different, but I'm not going to adhere the pinbacks straight to the plates because they're actually really, really small, and I'm concerned that there may not be enough surface area for good adhesion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sandwich those between the plate and another piece of aluminum that has a hole drilled in it, and hopefully that will give me more surface area to attach everything to and to hold better.
I squared off the edges on a piece of 14 gauge aluminum and then went through and marked 1-inch intervals all the way down the strip. I then went through and cut out all of these little 1-inch pieces of aluminum.
Okay, so now I've got to take all of these little squares and drill a hole in the middle. In retrospect, I should have gone through and marked the strip before I cut it into 1-inch pieces and drilled the holes. Would have been a hell of a lot easier to hold while I drilled them. As it is now, I get to cut my fingers to shreds.
This is what it's going to look like when they're all done, I hope. I originally tried to stack these up and clamp them all together, and I tried a bunch of different things, but the end result was that it was just faster and easier for me to go through and drill each one of these individually. And once they were all done, went through and used a angle grinder to clean up the backside where the hole punched through. Got all the little ones cut out. I made a slightly larger one for the chest diamond. Test fitted it when it worked, drilled the holes, or tried anyways. Cleaned the plate up with an angle grinder, and then welded the plate in place. The chest diamond done, I was on to the collar. And basically just a tiny little tack weld in each one of the corners of each one of the plates so that everything stays attached. Got the collar done, and then it was onto the right side chest piece. Once the right side chest piece was done, it was onto the ab plate. And then 3 on each shoulder bell. And then 120 grit flat disc on the angle grinder, and it's time to clean up all of the flat surfaces, get all the marker off of them, and start working on cleaning up the edges, rounding them over a little bit, and basically these are the final touches that make the armor look a little nicer. Rounded off the bottom of the edges so that they were all roughly equal in length, and basically just cleanup time. Some sort of really weird lens flare on that one. Sorry about that. Anyhow, once I had all the things attached and everything cleaned up on the front, what I did was I backed up each one of the sections I had removed darted metal to fold them over, fold the edges over. So I backed them up with a piece of aluminum and then went through and filled them in with filler rod. And then from there, I grounded the filler rod so that the edges were nice and smooth, and went through and one final time to clean up all of the edges, make sure they were as flat as I could get them. And once again, started at the collar and got that piece finished, and then moved on to the chest diamond. Got everything welded up there, then ground that one down. Used the welding table to clean up the flat sections on the ab plate, and then welded up all the darts in the ab plate. From there, it was basically rinse and repeat on all the plates. Just filled in the darts, then ground them all down, and gave them a good final cleanup.
So here is the finished kit. If you saw us at DragonCon, there were 3 of us this year, 2 of us previous years. He was able to wear it a couple of nights out, and he actually was able to get in it and march in the con crawl, Mandalorian con crawl on Sunday night. Held together for the most part. We've got a few little issues that we've got to resolve, but I did not show the prep and painting. This was part of the thing that I was working on the morning of we were leaving, was getting things taped off and painted. So I'm actually pretty fortunate that the paint did not just slough off. So that wraps up the video for the large majority of the major parts to his Mandalorian kit. We've got a few little sub videos that will be coming out. Most of them are pretty simple things like wet molding his holsters, how we created the girth belts, and how we mounted the chest display in his armor. So I will get those up online, and I will see you next week.